Carl Trueman, welcome to the Scattered Seeds podcast. You've had a good run the last 2 years since you were last on the show. It's unbelievable.
Yes, I think as you commented earlier, you made me what I am today. The break on your show was the big thing that happened.
Right, so we expect an honorarium from that, okay?
I'll speak to my lawyers about that.
Good.
No, we joke about it, but you've become an academic celebrity. You were telling us earlier that your book has sold 75,000 copies.
Something like that, yes. That was the last I heard. So,
and that's as many copies as all your combined sales of all your prior works.
Plus, goodness,
by
plus
a factor
60,000 or something, I suspect.
Yeah. I mean, people don't understand. I've had one book published. Books typically don't sell large numbers of copies, and especially academic books. 75,000 copies for an academic book is enormous. And my question that I wanted to begin with, because it segues from that, is to what do you attribute the enormous popularity of your book? Is it your looks? Is it your humor?
What's my haircut? I think.
But it's been phenomenal. Everywhere I turn, I just saw a letter you had in the Wall Street Journal on Saturday. You've been written about in many publications. You're on so many channels. It seems like everywhere I turn, there's Carl Trueman, and
more of it. That's
yeah. And we love you. You're a great guy, and everyone says that about you. But that in and of itself speaks to the situation we're in right now, I think.
Yeah, I was very surprised at the success of the book. I mean, very gratified. When I wrote it, I did not expect. I thought it'd be the most interesting, from my perspective, book I'd ever written, but I did not expect it necessarily to resonate with the public in general. Mm-hmm. I think the thing that has made it popular is it attempts to give clarity to an issue, the issue of identity, that in different ways is affecting just about everybody. I mean, one of the striking things I've discovered as I've been speaking all over the place in the last 6 months, almost every time I speak, somebody will come up to me afterwards with a deeply personal story about how the sexual revolution has damaged their family, or how they have a spouse or a child or a sibling who is transitioning from one gender to another. So I think although the book in some ways is dealing with some fairly rarefied and abstract ideas, bottom line is these things are affecting a lot of people, and people are looking for something that helps them to understand particularly how perhaps their children are thinking, that help them give clarity to why the rising generation don't necessarily respond to issues such as LGBTQ plus matters in the way that the people of our generation do. So I think that's a large part of it. This is a big issue for everybody, and everybody's looking for some kind of clarity or help on it.
Yeah. I know from my own experience that book tours are always an education unto themselves. Besides that point, what other things have you learned from the public reaction to the book and people you've met?
I've been struck at how this is an issue that goes across the religious spectrum in some ways. At one point, the most unusual invitation I'd had was to speak at the Napa Institute, which is a conservative Catholic gathering in California. But on the heels of that came invitations from the Deseret Journal to write an op-ed for them and to attend a big Mormon Latter-day Saints conference to speak on this issue. And I was very clear when I talked to the Latter-day Saints on the phone. I said, you realize that I'm not on the same page as you. We understand that, but we too in our families and our communities are facing the same struggles. So I think the fact that this isn't just a conservative Christian issue, it's affecting an awful lot of families across the spectrum. That's one thing. And secondly, I've been struck at how kind people have been towards me. It means a lot when I get emails from parents or from students who I've never met, but they've just emailed me to thank me for the book. And I don't say that to big myself up at all. One of the most gratifying things to me has been I wrote a book primarily, I suppose, for a sort of thoughtful / academic audience. And it seems to have been something that has struck a chord with all kinds of different people. And I've been very touched by the encouragements and affirmations I've had from others.
I wonder if your book found it came at the right time. It seems to be kind of a companion book from my perspective with Abigail Schreier's book, Irreversible Damage, which got some notoriety because it was being banned on Amazon and Target. But she seems to have struck a chord as well. And your book has more of the academic philosophical underpinnings of what's happening, and she's taking a more journalistic approach as to what's been happening with real life accounts of families and children, and giving the history or the story of those tragic occurrences. And so there seems to be a bit of a groundswell of interest right now, and books like yours and Abigail Schreier's is meeting a real felt need that's out there in the culture.
Yeah, and I think that's where the T in the LGBTQ is interesting for a number of reasons. There are various reasons why the T is an odd element in that alliance. But it's one thing to have a child come out and say they're gay or they're same-sex attracted. When you're having prepubescent kids coming out and saying they're trans, the implications are lifelong and devastating.
Yeah, they're horrifying.
It's one thing for a 23-year-old even to come out as trans.
Right.
It's another thing for a 7, 8, 9, 10-year-old. I think that a lot of parents rightly feel they have a responsibility to protect their children from themselves. We all do that in our different ways.
Right.
And yet here we have this perfect storm of political lobbyists and pressure building from the one side, parents from the other. What do the parents do? How do they understand the situation? Is it as terrible and traumatic as it seems to be? And the answer is yes. And these are the reasons why. And I think Abigail Schreier's book is, what I do is try to do the theory and the history. What Abigail Schreier does is provide the heartbreaking human stories.
Right.
I held back from reading the Schreier book for many months after I'd bought it simply because I knew it would be so depressing.
Yeah.
And I finally, just a month ago, I was on a plane flight, I said, I've got to read this thing, and it's so relentlessly depressing. And you realize that, issues I deal with as sort of historically interesting are tearing families apart and destroying lives across the United States and the Western world.
That's probably why it's resonated so fulsomely with the public. You know, it really hits an emotional chord. In August, I read this piece in the Wall Street Journal. I was my daily habit, and I saw Carl Trueman in the lead, and that, of course, caught my attention. You were booted off the air twice at an event while you were being live streamed on the YouTube channel. Sacramento Gospel Conference in California.
It was.
Can you tell us a little bit about that, because it seemed a pretty bizarre idea.
Well, it was interesting. It was actually giving pretty much the same. I was giving us 2 lectures, what I'd already given as 1 lecture to the Latter-day Saints earlier that week, and I flew from Salt Lake City to Sacramento and was speaking at a Reformed Baptist conference there, and they were live streaming. And the interesting thing is they did it on 2 YouTube live streams. They did one that was publicly advertised and one that was private, just known to some church members. And the public channel was pulled during my first talk, and the reason for it being pulled was they'd breached copyright. They'd done a soundtrack from Spotify. It was a fair cop kind of thing. So they adjusted that. And then lo and behold, I think it was during the second session, I get pulled again. And they inquire of YouTube why, and apparently they'd received a complaint about content violation. I'd engaged in, I suppose, what we might call, this is not YouTube's language, but I'm thinking that they're thinking I've engaged in something that might be popularly called hate speech or bigoted talk, that kind of thing. Ironically, the video was later put up on YouTube without problem, which would indicate that I hadn't violated the content at all. But what it indicated was A, somebody is watching me and making a complaint, and B, these big tech companies they assume guilt until innocence is proven.
Innocent. Yeah.
And that, I think, those two things, one is personally worrying, the other one is both personally and professionally worrying, if I could put it that way. And I happened to mention this incident to a friend who was writing an article. I didn't know he was writing an article with the Wall Street Journal, and I became a sort of cause célèbre. It's a relatively trivial bit of cancelling, but,
it is
emblematic.
It is. I read it that way too, but it did raise the larger subject in my mind, which is the extent to which you are concerned about censorship of Christians in the public domain. I mean, is that something that concerns you right now?
I think so. And afterwards, I did a round table with Ryan Anderson and Claire Morrell at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, and a legal person from the Napa Institute, talking about the role that big tech is playing. And I think it's something that could develop in something that isn't just whether you're allowed to put your sermons online, live stream your sermons. Mm-hmm. The way big tech is slowly but surely taking over all avenues of commerce, we could face a situation where a group like Venmo won't process your payments or something like that. Yeah. So I think it's worth Christians at this point being very aware that this kind of stuff is starting to happen. And it may not stop at the level of a lecturer giving a lecture that gets nixed. It could affect even the smallest and humblest church in your neighborhood from being able to carry out financial business, do payroll and things. So not in the short term. I don't think it's going to happen next week or the week after. But 4 or 5 years down the line, we could be living in a very different world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, your book certainly makes the point that there's a slow roll on a lot of these subjects. Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things that's fascinating about the book is that really you make the case that the seeds of Obergefell versus Hodges were planted centuries ago.
Yeah.
And I think that's a thought that doesn't naturally occur to many Christians.
No.
They see it in the here and now. They don't really understand the antecedents that were planted a long time ago.
I can't remember who it was that said to me early in my academic career, in the context of theology and theological teaching, he made the comment to the effect that it's always important to think about what your teaching will look like 3 generations from now. Mm-hmm. And I think the point being made was you've got to be careful that you don't leave theological hostages to fortune. I think that's not a bad rule of life, actually, in terms of a lot of things that are going on today.
Yeah.
What are the implications? As Christians, we have a responsibility to transmit the faith faithfully from generation to generation. Yeah. And I think that requires a high degree of historical self-consciousness on our part.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and to be able to trace those antecedents. One of the things that I really appreciated about your book is that if the thesis of ideas have consequences by, I can't remember the name of the gentleman who wrote that book.
Oh, Richard Weaver.
Richard Weaver,
yes,
right. If that's the thesis, your book is the conclusion to that thesis.
The rather depressing conclusion.
that ideas really do have consequences. And these things do tend to be generational.
Yeah.
But the changing of the frame, the movement toward that eminent frame that you described in the book, and the way in which these things shift incrementally and slowly over time, do require a level of perception and attention that we may not typically want to give.
Yeah.
And what I think your book has done so marvelously and helpfully to the Christian church is it's ringing a clarion call to pay attention to these kinds of things. Now that we see, as you've traced those lines historically, if we continue down this road and we don't make the adjustments, that's our fault. Yeah. It's on us now. Yeah. And so it's up to us as the church, and up to us as those who want to be committed to a transcendent reality, to recognize that these things have to be met where we find them. These kinds of changes aren't going to be met with a loud single blow of the hammer that's going to crack it open. It has to be done incrementally and slowly, but we have to meet it at every point in which we find it. Yeah. At the local level, at the regional level, perhaps at a national level, but certainly and always at the local level. And to the extent that we don't do that, we are conceding and we're giving up ground.
Yeah.
History will remember us for that.
Yeah.
You had a recent article in Touchstone magazine, and there was this sentence that really intrigued me. Religious or irreligious, we are all expressive individuals now, seeing the purpose of life as feeling good and anything that hinders that as being evil. I thought that was very intelligently observed and written. And it made me wonder, how do Christians escape the trap of expressive individualism?
Yeah, that's a hard one.
Because in that quotation, you were definitely tying the religious and the irreligious together. And, it's disturbing on some level.
Yeah.
What do we do about that?
It's difficult, and I think it's rendered difficult by a number of things. One, expressive individualism, this idea that we are at our most authentic really when we express outwardly that which we are inwardly. That's not an entirely bad thing. I mean, there's a reason why we have words like hypocrite, two-faced. And it's also...
Integrity means something.
Yeah, integrity means something. Transparency means something. And I think there's also a sense in which expressive individualism is pointing to the reality of the inner space in our lives. I said to the students, I wish I'd made this point in the book, actually. It's so obvious now, I should have done it. But while Rousseau is writing his discourses that in many ways crystallize the problem, Jonathan Edwards is writing on the religious affections. That the 18th century is an era of exploring that inner space, and one would want to affirm the importance of that inner space. So the first thing that makes it difficult is expressive individualism, like so many terrible errors, does grab hold of something that's true. The second thing that makes it difficult is one of the things that Tocqueville notes about the American experiment compared to the old Europe that he comes from is religious freedom. And religious freedom is a great thing. I don't want to live in Iran or China. I delight in living in a country where I'm able to choose where I go to church or choose not to go to church on a Sunday. And I think that religious freedom is an important thing. But like so many great things, religious freedom is not an unqualified good. And what religious freedom does, of course, is it tilts, for want of a better word, it tilts power towards the congregant. It tilts power towards the customer. And I think one of the problems we face as Christians is we all tend to shop, to use that terrible word, for our churches. Whether you're a traditionalist or a contemporary worship person, we can all tend to gravitate towards the church that scratches us where we itch.
You make that point in the book, and it's, as a pastor, it causes your head to just bow a little bit because you realize, oh, he's exactly right. This is what I've been dealing with.
And this create. How do we solve this problem? There is no obvious answer to it. I think some of it has to come from Christians. Well, first of all, once you know the script, you can change the script somewhat. Merely knowing that this is a problem changes the landscape somewhat.
Right.
Secondly, I think Christians need to be more self-disciplined about these things, individually. Thirdly, and this is really a Protestant problem, it's not a Catholic or an Eastern Orthodox problem. I would love to see Protestants taking the unity of the church more seriously. Ecumenism has a bad name because certainly the old form of ecumenism tended to default to let's marginalize doctrine and pretend it's not significantly different. I would love to see churches more inter-church activity in communities so that there's a more visible unity there, and therefore it becomes more difficult for people to drift from one church to another. What that looks like practically, that's hard to conceptualize, and it may look different in fact, it certainly would look different in Pittsburgh to a rural Slippery Rock or Grove City. But I think that conscious reflection upon moving towards some kind of visible unity, maybe not institutional unity, but a greater degree of visible unity, cutting down the options, we might say, might be part of it.
And you wrote that before COVID. And out of necessity, our church included, we and a lot of other churches had to go to an online format that allowed for continued participation in life of the church in a remote way. But what that did was it created the plausibility structure, if you will, in which people could begin to imagine themselves, or social imaginary, in which folks could be able to imagine themselves as being faithful in their participation in the life of the church from their couch. But really what was underneath that was another layer of expressive individualism. I prefer this mode as to opposed to any other mode. It seems as though it's faithful, but it's not. It's not faithful.
That's true. I mean, I hope that one of the things that will ultimately emerge is that bodies are important.
Right.
It's okay to watch church online, but when you're on your deathbed, you don't want to be looking at your pastor through an app on your smartphone.
Right.
You want your pastor sitting by your bedside.
Well, certainly the sacraments challenge that reality too.
I mean, I did hear, I was invited to participate in an online sort of talk with Rusty Reno from First Things, who's Roman Catholic, Rabbi Mark Gottlieb, Orthodox Jewish, and myself talking about worship in a time of COVID. It was, you could tune in and listen to us talking, and I mentioned to Rusty in this conversation that I was aware of some Protestant churches where they were having communion virtually.
Right.
The minister was doing it on the screen, and people at home had got a loaf of bread and a glass of wine. And of course, to a Catholic, the blood just drained from his cheeks at that point.
Yep.
I do think sacraments, yes, but you've got to have a good theology of the sacraments.
Exactly.
Otherwise, people will think, I can do it at home by myself. And our church in Grove City would switch off the live stream when it came to the Lord's Supper. And the pastor told me we did that because we didn't want people communing at home by themselves. You've got to actually go to church to
It's difficult to affirm the real presence of Christ in some manner and have sort of this voyeuristic sort of observation of the thing that you think that you're participating in, but you're not. I mean, praise God that COVID came at a time when we had online church, because it was better than nothing.
Right. I mean, certainly don't want to be ungrateful for the medium. On the other hand, it's a poor substitute for the real thing.
And then you add that to an increasing instinct toward expressive individualism, and it just becomes one option among many. I prefer this over that. It's great. I mean, if you want to go in and drive in and take the time to put on a coat and tie and take communion, that's fine, but I prefer this. And the world in which we're living in which authority has been weakened and decimated in many ways, there's no rebuttal to that. That seems to be pervasive. I wonder what you think about the necessity now, and you kind of allude to it towards the end of your book as you're wrapping things up on Wither the Church. What is the church's response? And I have another question related to that later, but what is your thoughts about, in the world in which we're living in with expressive individualism, the role of assertion? What role does assertion play? Charitable, kind, obviously, but truth that is asserted in a world in which, as long as it's okay for me, it's okay.
The problem, of course, is that intuitively assertion is now implausible. We tend to think of assertion as oppression.
Right.
To assert a truth is to marginalize. I was talking with the students this morning about how institutions have been transformed over the last, certainly 100, but even the last 20, 30 years. And I talked about the family. I said, it's problematic now to assert a definition of the family, because as soon as you do that, you're saying that certain arrangements that are already called families don't qualify, and that's marginalizing. So I think assertion culturally is implausible. On the other hand, I don't think that Christians have any choice other than to do that, because as Martin Luther says in The Bondage of the Will, if you take away assertions, you take away Christianity. Christianity makes specific claims about events in time and space. And J. Gresham Machen does a very similar thing in Christianity and Liberalism. Christianity rests on historic claims. And that's where I think it's important as Christians that we remember that proclamation, an assertion of Christian truth, is a supernatural thing. There is a sense in which, we may live in a world where assertions are deemed to be inherently implausible simply because they're assertions, but we also live in a world where the Lord has said he will take his word and through his Spirit apply it to the heart. So one of the things I think that Christians mustn't do at this point is panic because the odds seem so huge and so great. What technique can we develop for solving it? Well, I don't think we need a technique. I think first and foremost we need a good theology that will give us confidence in what we do. And I do think that even today, there are ways in which some assertions are plausible. If I'm talking to somebody who's committed to a particular form of sexual lifestyle, it's possible to get hold of government statistics on health and life expectations relative to certain sexual activities and lifestyles that I think still resonate with people. One thing COVID's taught us is you present people with data in a scientific form about how it might damage or harm or curtail their life, and they'll still take it seriously. So I think there are assertions and assertions.
Yeah. I've always thought that folks are relativists until they have to encounter pain. If you take their hand and smack it with a hammer, you say, that's just, you're just thinking that. That's not real pain. Oh no, it's real.
You're like me. I use a lot of violent images in class, and I can see we're kindred spirits on this.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. I'm glad to have the confirmation of that.
What kind of reactions are you getting from your students on your book?
Generally positive. A lot of them have bought copies for their parents that I've signed, which has been kind of fun. But Grove City students, of course, are not a representative slice of 18 to 22-year-olds. They tilt towards either the religiously conservative or the socially conservative because of the geographical areas and the demographics we tend to draw students from. But I've been very gratified. I did write the book. The research was done before I arrived at Grove, but the book was written after I arrived, and I wrote it very consciously, knowing that I will have students in my class for whom some of these things are very personal struggles and challenges for them. And I wanted to write the book in a way that I would not be embarrassed to see one of them reading it thinking, oh man, I wish I'd expressed myself differently. So I tried in the book to be very matter of fact and descriptive rather than evaluative. I think anybody who reads the book knows where I'm coming from. But I wanted to write the book in a way that a gay person or somebody struggling with gender dysphoria could read it and say, well, maybe I disagree with Trueman, but he's not disrespectfully treated my position.
Yeah, I agree with that.
I tried to do that.
The tone in the book is very even.
Excellent.
It's very even-handed. How long did it take you to write the book?
From Crossway and Rod Dreher approaching me about doing something on Philip Reef to submitting the manuscript was about 4 years.
Wow. 4 years, yeah.
I was very blessed, very grateful to Professor Robert George and Professor Brad Wilson at Princeton, who gave me a year-long fellowship on the Madison program, which not only gave me time to write, to think and do reading, the writing was done afterwards, but also meant that I was on a fellowship program with a number of other academics who were specialists in areas that I needed to address, but was not competent simply to look at myself. So Nathan Pinkowski, for example, Adeline Allen, good friends who helped me navigate some of the more technical, philosophical and legal aspects of what I was looking at.
As a writer myself, I've always been curious to ask other writers about how they write. How do you write? I mean, do you have a certain idea of pages you're going to write per day, words per day, morning, afternoon, evening, all of the above?
At the end of the day, he collects all the napkins and all of the envelopes that he's been scribbling things down.
Longhand, computer, what's the procedure?
It depends on the time of year, but during term time, I try to get into my office, my study at home. On the days when I'm not in at 8 o'clock at college, I try to get in maybe 7:30 and do some writing, often on articles or op-ed kind of things. Books where I have a more extended period of thinking, that tends to be done more during the summertime when I have the time to sit and really think things through. I read something, I think it was by Ernest Hemingway, many years ago, and he made the comment that he tried to write a page a day, something like that, and his comment was, I write a page a day, and if 9 out of the 10 pages are rubbish, that's still 52 good pages in a year.
Right, yeah.
At various points in my career, I've worked at places where there have been colleagues who have a lot of talent, a lot of great ideas, and just seem to sit around waiting for that period where they can just sit and write that's never going to come.
Would you describe yourself as a tortured writer, or are you? No, you seem.
I write pretty. It's like a
fluid,
a compulsive disorder with me. I think I like to write. I like to think on paper.
Do you rewrite a lot?
So in this book, not so much rewriting, but on the op-ed type stuff I do know. That tends to be one take, check it for spelling, repetition, then send it off.
Yeah.
This book took a lot of time working on the structure.
Yeah.
I had lunch with it was actually an old colleague from Aberdeen University, Gordon Graham, who's latterly he was professor of philosophy at Princeton Theological Seminary. And while I was at Princeton for the year, I got together with Gordon and we had lunch, and I outlined the project to him, and his comment was, it's just not possible. It's too ungainly a topic. You can never, and that made me acutely aware that structure was going to be a difficulty.
Yeah.
And I would say this work, it took a lot of work on structure. The material was all there, but how do I get it to fit together so that there aren't odd gear changes? And Grove were very generous. The Institute for Faith and Freedom provided me with a research assistant, Kirsten Holmberg, for whom this was not really her area. But the great thing that Kirsten did for me was I would just send her stuff and say, okay, read it from a naive novice perspective and tell me, can you follow the argument? Does it make sense? Does it fit together? And she was really great in coming back and saying, I think this bit would work better here, or I think if you rearrange this order here. Yeah. Or at times it was question, I think we just need to leave this out. That's another book. So for example, in the final book, there's not a whole lot on technology, and I think technology is critical to the narrative of where we are. But I couldn't deal with it and maintain the tightness of storyline that I had in this book.
Yeah.
I would imagine that the challenge of this book too is that not only are you tracing antecedents historically, and so you're moving in this direction, but you're also moving horizontally in the sense that you're working with Reef, and you're working with Taylor, and you're working with McIntyre, and you're working across certain thinkers as well, in addition to working through time. That's a fairly complex way of thinking. And to hold that all together, I mean, 4 years doesn't seem like enough time actually to do that.
Yeah, it was.
But you did it.
It was. I mean, the key for me as well was how do I use those three guys? And originally, I'd brought them in the latter section. They were going to be part of the final chapters on the present day. And then it became clear to me, no, I could actually, why don't I shift them to the front? And use them. Okay, these are going to be, this is basically the definition of terms and the organizing principles for the narrative I'm going to tell. That was a key move. But as I say, 4 years is not a long time, but it helps to have a year off at Princeton. It really does.
Well, and I think your interaction with them across, not only through time, but across those thinkers, makes for a very strong book and a very strong argument in terms of your analysis and your assessment of what's happening, because they are lending weight and gravity to everything that you're saying. You know, you can disagree with Trueman, but if you're going to disagree with Trueman and Reef and McIntyre and Taylor, then you're crazy.
Well, and there's an amorphous quality to what you're talking about in the book. I mean, there are certain things that are not immediately intuitive, such as the romantics. You know, because I was an English lit major in college, and until reading that section, that had not really occurred to me how it would fit into the entirety of the storyline.
Yeah, and that chapter was a little bit of self-indulgence because I love the romantics. So it was a way of, I want to write about these guys. But it was when I read, I came across it somewhat randomly when I was doing some research on Rousseau, and I came across Shelley. And Shelley makes this comment, I think it's in his Defense of Poetry, it may be elsewhere, where he's listing the great philosophers. And then he says at some point, he says, all of these philosophers are influential, but the only true philosopher is Rousseau, because he was also a poet. And that intrigued me. And I thought, there's something going on here. What's going on? And that was how the romantic chapter started to unfold for me.
Let's circle back to technology for a second, because you just brought that up. And obviously the creation of the iPhone in 2007 was a game changer. As a historian, you'd certainly acknowledge that while things progress incrementally, there are also fits and starts. There are spurts. And it seems to me that in the whole thesis of expressive individualism, that the iPhone was a game changer.
And social media.
But social media was really a creation of the iPhone.
Of the iPhone, yeah.
The iPhone begat social media, begat Instagram, begat, a higher level of porn, a higher level of, sharing photographs of your genitalia, the kind of ridiculous things that are now happening.
And then you have that story about Instagram and young girls in the Wall Street Journal, that article that just came out. I think it was Instagram.
Yeah, it was Instagram.
Yeah, that is really targeting these young girls.
Yeah, and creating more despondency, more depression, more suicidal tendencies across the board.
Yeah.
So it seems to me that moment, that invention in 2007 was a game changer in this conversation about expressive individualism.
Yes.
Talk about that a little bit.
Well, it works on several different levels. I mean, first of all, there's my general point in the book, really drawn from Hegel via Charles Taylor, which I think is a sound one, is of course that our sense of self and self-worth is socially constructed. We tend to be who we are because of the relationships we have. And that also involves what Charles Taylor, again drawing on Hegel, calls recognition. Our sense of self-worth comes from the group of people we have who acknowledge us for who we think we are. And for guys of our generation, that tended on the whole to be the people we were in physical proximity to. And it was a relatively small group of people. We would call trusted friends, acquaintances, etc. What social media does, of course, is it massively increases that pool of people by whom we need to be recognized.
Yeah, recognition becomes instantaneous.
It becomes instantaneous, and it also becomes very public.
Yeah.
In that what you think of me, I might know it, and you might know it, and a handful of people might know it, but it's not there for anybody in the world to view. Once it's on social media, I think the pool of people that we trust for our self-worth becomes potentially infinite and highly unstable. So I think there's that aspect, the anxiety part of it. Secondly, on the expressive individualism, if at the heart of expressive individualism lies the notion that life ultimately boils down to performance, and this is why Oscar Wilde in some ways is he's the archetypal man of his age, life as public performance. Well, we can all be Oscar Wildes now. All the world is a stage if you're on Instagram.
Yeah.
So I think the capacity for performance becomes huge. And as Yuval Levine has argued, this correlates with a transformation in the nature of institutions. When I went to school, we had to wear a uniform. We had to wear a uniform. Why? Because school was not about being an individual. English grammar school in the 1980s was about having your individuality crushed in order to become a team player. It's why team sports were so important in the English educational system.
Conformity was the emphasis.
The school was a place to be formed.
Right.
Now, I was watching the news just a couple of weeks ago, and there was a story on there about a school trying to introduce uniforms. And one of the parents was saying, we don't want uniforms, why can't we just let the kids express themselves?
Yep.
That's an unconscious acknowledgement of precisely the way schools have been transformed in the last half century. So social media also ties in with that general transformation of institutions. But what it does is it puts all of this stuff, to use a slightly, I suppose, tasteless image, it puts expressive individualism on crack. Suddenly it gets supercharged. And it's everywhere, it's all embracing, the private and the public are collapsed into each other. The whole experience of life is dramatically transformed.
Do you think there are any vestiges of institutions of formation left? I was really intrigued when I was reading that portion in your book. I spent a lot of time in my D-Min work looking at Galatians 4:19 and Paul's admonition to the church in Galatia, where he said, my little children, in whom I am in constant travail until Christ is formed in you. Morphao, this idea of formation in the likeness and the image of God. And that idea of formation runs parallel with our understanding of the gospel. There's creation, fall, and redemption, or you might call it formation, deformation,
Yeah.
reformation. Of course, recognizing there's a fourth part of the story in the consummation. But I hadn't considered how formation, deformation, reformation has been eclipsed by formation, deformation, performation, you might say, performance. We've lost a reformation instinct at all, and everything is performance. Are there institutions of formation? I wonder, even if the church is a strong enough place as an institution of formation.
They are, in the West, crumbling rapidly. I mean, the one place one might go, you think the military.
Yes.
The military, because the military depends not upon, you don't want a battlefield full of individuals. You need a block that thinks as a block.
As I heard one time, there's the right way, the wrong way, and the military way. You are formed in that way.
But the other week, there's been this debate about whether transgender people can serve in the military. And I've heard the language of, well, why shouldn't we allow transgender people to find their personal fulfillment in the military? Well, that's an interesting shift in language.
It is,
Part of me will say, I don't want people going into the military to find personal fulfillment. I want people going into the military who can be part of a team to do the work that I don't want to dirty my hands with in order to keep the nation safe. When you start getting that logic creeping into debates about the military, the church is one thing, but the military, of all places, the military should be a formational
a place that has had tradition and history, and they have folded their shirts for the same way for 250 years. And now it's a jump ball. You can have it your way.
And their training was always based upon they break you first in order to rebuild you in their image. Not to affirm you. Absolutely not to affirm you.
It's the height of conformity, not performance.
I asked you earlier about the place or the role that assertion has. What about resistance? What role do institutions, the church included, have when it comes to resisting these kinds of performance or deformational pressures that are being put upon us?
I think it's a critical role. I prefer the language of cultural resistance to culture war. I know the Bible uses martial language. There is a spiritual war going on. It's not illegitimate to talk about a spiritual war. What I found with students at Grove is the language of warfare doesn't resonate particularly well with a lot of young people. And I'm not sure that it communicates quite the model of spiritual warfare that I find the New Testament teaching. I think spiritual resistance is a better way of communicating that. And I think the role of resistance is this: the church has to model here and now a better way. What is the best argument for traditional marriage? It's good marriages. It's good marriages. Yes, we should certainly use our civil liberties and our civil rights and our votes to campaign for good public policies. But the best way to persuade people that traditional marriage is the best way to organize society is to exhibit good marriages to society.
Don't divorce at the same rate as secular marriages, as David Ayres has pointed out.
Absolutely. David's statistics, I always find, when he sends them to me on email, I always have to brace myself to open them because they're always chilling and they're always disappointing. David has done sterling work in this area. And take divorce seriously. I make this point in the book that so many Christians are obsessed with Obergefell v. Hodges as the key move in redefining marriage, was actually and tragically it's Ronald Reagan in 1970 signing no-fault divorce into law in California. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't think Ronald Reagan had any idea of where it was going to go.
Ideas have consequences.
But ideas have consequences. And how many churches have hit out hard against gay marriage but have been happy to tolerate no-fault divorce? And I've, don't misread me on this, but I have every sympathy in some ways with a gay couple saying, how dare you criticize my marriage when you have not taken the Bible's teaching on marriage seriously, when it has suited you not to take it seriously. Going back to your assertions comment, the gospel is not a lifestyle. But lifestyles speak very, very powerfully nonetheless. They can provide a context in which the gospel gets a hearing.
The horse is out of the barn in many respects. And and we are no longer in a position where we can assume that things are going to naturally correct themselves.
No.
They're only going to be corrected if we begin to assert and put some kind of pressure toward the end that we want to see.
Yeah, I think the default today on moral thinking is if moral practices create a problem, then we simply need to develop the technology or the technique to overcome the problem.
Right.
This is why abstinence education, which would seem to be the obvious way of dealing with teenage pregnancies, is rejected as oppressive. No, the answer is easier access to abortion or easier access to contraceptives. When you take a step,
always tilts to the individual.
And when you take a step back and you see how our answer as a society to the problems of teen pregnancy, et cetera, has been more and more graphic and libertine teaching on sex, that's insane. It's clearly insane.
Yes.
But such are the times we live in that madness appears to be sanity at this point.
Right. Oh man, it's
Well, I loved your first page of your book on that when you talked about your grandfather and what his reaction would have been to the idea that I'm a man living in a woman's body.
Yeah.
Or a woman living in a man's body.
Whatever.
Either way.
He would have been confused by it. Trust me.
Yeah. Wasn't that long ago that we could remember a world like that.
Yeah.
And you're forced to ask the question, was that whole generation simply unenlightened?
Yeah.
And you make reference.
Well, it's not just that generation, it was every generation.
Every generation
prior to them,
exactly.
yeah.
Right.
Everybody until the day before yesterday was either unenlightened or a bigot. That's the kind of bird.
What are your memories of your grandfather?
Oh, very fond ones.
Yeah.
I love my granddad very much.
Yeah. What did he? What was his career? What did
He
do?
he would not even have, if you'd asked him what his career was, I don't think he'd have known what the question was.
His occupation.
He was a sheet metal worker in a factory in Birmingham. Left school at 14 and retired at 65 and did the same job every day of his working life.
Was he a religious man?
Not that I know of. No. But he was your typical, ordinary, working class, industrial heartland guy.
I know you're talking this coming weekend at a conference called No Neutral Ground. It's Touchstone Conference, The Cost of Discipleship in the Secular Age. And the title intrigued me. What is the cost of discipleship in a secular age?
I think it's at this point in time, for us in the United States, it's going to be cultural marginalization.
Yeah.
I think there are going to be some cases, for example, the Kate Baker case, the florist case, refusing to serve gay weddings. There are going to be individual Christians who will suffer terribly for their faith. I think for most of us, it's going to involve mockery and marginalization. And I hesitate to call that persecution because it's relatively light lifting in the grand scheme of things. But I think
it is a cost.
Yeah, I think that those Christians who think that they can have their cake and eat it, those Christians who think that it's going to be possible to be well thought of in a broader secular culture, I would put it sarcastically, those Christians who think they're still going to be welcome at New York Times cocktail parties in Manhattan are living in a fool's paradise. They're fools. They're fools or frauds. And I don't think they will stand in what's going to come. I think we have to accept that cultural marginalization is going to be our lot. It would be a tragedy if we don't see that as an opportunity, if all we do is see that as a major setback, because historically, marginal communities tend to become strong communities. And even the LGBTQ is witness to that. It was their marginality that has made them strong. 19th century. The Jews in medieval Europe, the nonconformists in 19th century industrial England.
Christians behind the iron block.
Christians behind the Iron Curtain. All of these groups have been marginal and have become strong as a result. And so I think that could be an opportunity for us. Probably not in my generation, but we have to be playing the long game here. We have to be thinking, well, what can we do now that will put the church in a strong position 100 years from now?
As a historian and able to kind of see the plot lines moving backward, and then perhaps seeing a trajectory moving forward, this idea of the cost of discipleship in a secular age. How do you see evangelicalism as a movement, I guess, or as an identity faring in the future?
That's a tough one because partly because evangelicalism is so diverse and so hard to define. I shrink from it as a term by and large because it's so broad. It encompasses the far right and the far left of the sort of relatively orthodox Christian Protestant spectrum.
You think it might splinter then as a result?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure that it's a single movement as it is.
Correct, yeah.
It's hard to see the thing that holds it all together. Maybe there are some institutions, Christianity Today, for example, but not all evangelicals would identify with Christianity Today. Not all would identify on the other side with the Gospel Coalition or the Southern Baptist Convention.
We should all come around First Things. That's what
I think first things. Yeah, though we're adding conservative Catholics and Orthodox Jews into the mix, of course. But I think that Orthodox, small O Orthodox Christianity should be well placed for this. If we use the resources that we have a creed that has stood the test of time.
Yeah, I was going to ask you if it's confessional evangelicals.
I think confessional evangelicalism, confessional forms of Christianity where people know what they believe. The way I talk about it in class is I say, for a religion to be successful, we can think about it in terms of creed, code, and cult. It needs a set of beliefs. It needs a set of principles by which its adherents live practically day by day in the world. And it needs a cult. It needs a form of worship that gives people a sense of belonging to each other and belonging to their God. And I think confessional Christianity has those three things. We have a confession, we have a creed, we have an ethical framework, and we have a form of worship. And what we need to do is, I think, focus on those and not allow ourselves to be distracted by the flotsam and jetsam of the immediate culture. If we're strong on those three things, then I think we're in a good place to address that which the culture throws at us.
Yeah, and I think that there's also still a strong remnant within broad evangelicalism that thinks that the future of the church can still be aligned with growth. This idea of growth and evangelism and church planning. And church planning is important and evangelism is important, but the idea that we're going to change the culture, or that if we get more voices out there evangelistically, we get more churches planted, that we're going to reap this great harvest of growth and bring folks back in the church. That just doesn't seem, based on my reading of the culture and the reading of the situation, that doesn't seem plausible to me.
No, I think we need to realize that this is a time of consolidation, not expansion. That's not an excuse for a day of small things. I think it's just the reality.
Well, also of purity. It's a time for purity.
Yeah, and that's why...
For obedience.
Yes, and that's why I think we need to be looking very carefully at how our leaders, generally informal leaders, of course, when you're dealing with evangelicalism, are relating to what's going on at the moment. I mean, Jesus isn't taking over Congress anytime soon.
Right.
We can't even get a conservative Protestant Supreme Court justice.
Right.
That's how weak we are. And I think that if we dissipate our energy focused on national politics rather than on being strong in our local communities, then we're missing a significant opportunity. And again, that's not to say that we shouldn't use our civil rights, we shouldn't use our vote, we shouldn't be engaged and informed about the national situation, but it is to say you can spend all day on Twitter and influence nobody. You can maybe help your neighbor cut their grass and have a huge influence on your neighbor.
So are you growing in your commitment to and the primacy of localism? Is that something that you've been...
I think it's something that I'm becoming really through reading Rod Dreher. It's something that I've come to realize. I think Rod is correct on this, that the local, the town where you live, the people you rub shoulders with, for me it's the college.
Yeah.
Okay, I enjoy writing my stuff first things and that, but I want to make sure that my classes are well taught first, because it's the students in my classes. It's opening my home to the students in class and church. It's having an influence on the people that I look at eyeball to eyeball, Monday to Friday. That's where I can have my real influence.
You're going to be a member of the Front Porch Republic here in Can I ask one more question from the book?
Sure.
If I could. At the very end, Wither the Church. I loved the book, loved everything. Your whole analysis was great. But you really got my attention on this last chapter, and you started to map out and outline some things. And then at the end, you say, basically, how do we do all of this today? And you're laying out some things, but you don't have the time to really fully explain some of your thoughts or to explore them, but you're hoping that this book will serve as a prolegomena to somebody who might write that.
Yeah.
I'm curious, do you have anybody in mind who you'd like to see write that, or are you
Rod
planning
Dreher.
are you planning on writing it yourself, and is there a volume 2 in the works that's a follow-up to this book?
There's a short version of this book in the works, but there's no follow-up. The shorter version does have a few more positive elaborations on where the church might go.
Okay.
But I always say I'm a historian, not a prophet. I tend to analyze the past rather than predict the future.
Yeah.
But I certainly hope that it gets the creative juices with some people going. I mean, I think Rod Dreher's Benedict Option is a very good book. Its strength is its weakness in that the title, the Benedict Option, is such a great marketing title. But from a Protestant perspective, it carries all these monastic connotations from page 1.
Right.
Which I don't really think Rod was sort of pressing there.
I didn't think
But
so when I read it.
If we could get a Protestant to do a Benedict Option, but cleansed of all connotations of monasticism, I think that would be helpful.
Yeah.
What we need is somebody to do a good, practical ecclesiology.
Is there anybody you have in mind that you'd love to commission to see them write that? Using your book as a prolegomena?
Are you hoping you'd be that
No,
candidate?
I'm not saying that I can do that. There's far more intelligent folks than me that could do that.
He's not a well-known figure, but Craig Troxell, who teaches practical theology at Westminster Seminary in California,
Okay.
he's a very fine thinker about ecclesiology, a very fine thinker about the communion of the saints. Craig, you're probably not watching or listening to this.
We'll send it to him.
If you're out there, I think a guy like that. I think it would be good, and the strength of Craig is this: he's only gone to Westminster, California to teach in the last couple of years. Prior to that, he was a real pastor in real churches for many, many years. And I think that sort of book should be written by somebody with deep practical experience in the church and in the lives of congregants. So I think from a reform perspective, Craig Troxell might be the man to do that.
All right. We'll call him up and tell him. Get to work.
Tell him Trueman.
Trueman,
fingered
your
your
job.
podcast.
You're a marked man now.
Well, Carl, thank you so
Yes.
Thanks
much
very much
for
for
being
having
a
me.
guest
Thank you.
on
Pleasure.
the show
Very
a
generous. Thank
second
you.
time.
Yeah.
The only person who has done that, and I
Right.
can think of no one better qualified
Absolutely.
It's been
to be
fun
a
to be back.
two-time guest on the Scattered
Thanks
Seeds
so much for having
podcast.
me.
Thank you.
The Scattered Seeds podcast is brought to you by Beverly Heights Presbyterian Church and our friends at Grove City College, where faith and freedom matter.